This is BBC News. A very warm welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the world. I'm Stephen Sackur. These are our top stories. World leaders condemn the attack on Europe's largest nuclear power plant. It is now secure. Ukraine's president accuses Moscow of nuclear terror.
We need to stop the Russian military immediately. Scream to your politicians. Ukraine is 15 nuclear units. If there is an explosion, it is the end of everything.
The International Atomic Energy Agency chief confirms the site was hit, but not the reactors themselves. No radioactive material has been released.
All the safety systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected.
Meanwhile, Mariupol in the south of Ukraine has become a city under siege as power and water supplies are cut off by relentless Russian shelling.
And I'm Yalda Hakim in Ukraine's western city of Lviv, which has become a hub for those fleeing the fighting.
More than 1 million civilians have now fled Ukraine. The EU says up to 4 million may try to leave and that it will welcome all refugees with open arms. Russian forces have seized the largest nuclear plant in Europe after shelling it overnight and causing a fire. The authorities say the plant is secure and radiation levels are normal. It's the latest indication of an intensified Russian assault across several fronts. The Zaporizhia plant is in the southeast of Ukraine. President Zelensky has accused Moscow of resorting to, quote, nuclear terror and urged Russians to protest. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said it shows the recklessness of this war. Elsewhere, the port city of Mariupol to the southeast is facing another day of heavy bombing, with most basic services like running water cut off. Hundreds of civilians have died. Kharkiv in the northeast much of it has been reduced to rubble. Ukraine says at least 47 people were killed by Russian airstrikes in the northern city of Chernihiv. And the Polish Border Guard Agency has confirmed that more than 672,000 people have now fled Ukraine to Poland since the war began last week. More than 99,000 people crossed the border just yesterday. My colleague Yalda Hakim is in Lviv in the west of Ukraine. It has become a home for tens of thousands of refugees fleeing the violence. Yalda, over to you.
Stephen, thank you. And as you say, the western city of Lviv really has become a hub for the tens of thousands of people who are fleeing the fighting. We're about 65 kilometers away from the Polish border, and that's where most of the people here are trying to make their way. Those who have remained here seeking shelter in hotels and other makeshift accommodation. But 9 days into this conflict, as you've been reporting, it does feel like things are increasingly getting more intense, more dangerous, and creating a real sense of fear even in this very peaceful part of the country. There is this sense of anxiety that the worst is yet to come. And that's also what we heard the French President Emmanuel Macron say in the last 24 hours after speaking to Vladimir Putin. Jonathan Jacobs has the latest.
The terrifying moment Ukraine's largest nuclear facility came under Russian fire. It may have been a training building outside the plant's perimeter, but it was real enough to wake world leaders in the middle of the night. The Zaporizhia power station supplies about a quarter of Ukraine's electricity. The head of the UN agency which oversees nuclear facilities said the fire was put out, averting fears of a nuclear disaster similar to Chernobyl.
It's important to say that all the safety systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected at all, and that there has been no release of radioactive material. The systems we have to measure the radiation are fully functional as well.
However, Ukraine's leader accused Russia of nuclear terror.
We need to stop the Russian military. Scream to your politicians. Ukraine has 15 nuclear units. If there is an explosion, it is the end of everything, the end of Europe.
The strike also led President Zelensky to speak again to US President Joe Biden, who, like other world leaders, urged Russia to cease its military activities. As foreign ministers from NATO, the G7 and European Union meet in Brussels to decide what more they can do to end the fighting, Russia has blamed the attack on the nuclear site on Ukrainian saboteurs, calling it a monstrous provocation. Western leaders are considering even more sanctions on Russia and warn Moscow they are prepared for all eventualities.
Ours is a defensive alliance. We seek no conflict, but if conflict comes to us, we're ready for it, and we will defend every inch of NATO territory.
China has also called for restraint as the destruction in Ukraine goes on. Warehouses to the east of the capital amongst the latest targets. In Kyiv, the shelling is now more sustained and coming closer to the center. In the south of the country, the port city of Mariupol has been besieged by Russian forces. The deputy mayor told the BBC they were trying to get it to capitulate by creating a humanitarian crisis, as those there suffer a third day without water and electricity. Fighting is also continuing here in Kharkiv, as more of Ukraine is destroyed by a Russian invasion, which shows no sign of ending soon. Jonathan Josephs, BBC News.
Well, as the international condemnation continues of the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin, every corner of this nation is now fully aware that this is a nation at war, and people are doing what they can to save their nation. The people here and the community here in Lviv are even making Molotov cocktails like other people, their countrymen in the south and east of the country. They know that the war could come here at any time, and they're getting ready.
Yalda, thank you very much indeed. There will be much more to come from Lviv and all of our team in Ukraine. But joining me right now is Ukraine's Energy Minister, German Kalashenko. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. Tell me, what is the situation at that nuclear power plant right now?
So at this stage, the firemen managed to stop the fire there. And of course, we also hear this declaration that the system not affected at this time, and the level of radiation is normal. But I must say that, of course, we understand the risk, and we already announced, our president already announced that this is a real nuclear terrorism. What has happened, because they shell directly to the station. They shell directly. They know what they did. And but of course, you know, the question here is also we are not happy that we discuss this in this framework. But we mentioned that the situation is really much more difficult than it even appears, because we are talking about 6 units, and that is true that the Zaporizhzhia NPP is the biggest in Europe. But despite that, in the Zaporizhzhia station, we also have a storage of nuclear waste, and in case they shell this storage, we would get really incredible situation, and that is not even the question of Ukraine.
Well, it doesn't bear thinking about, but let us just be clear. Who is in control of Zaporizhzhia power plant right now? Are your staff still there? Because we know the Russian military is surrounding the plant, but what exactly is the situation?
The staff is our here, and the Russian military, yes, they surround this station. Yeah, exactly.
So who is in charge? Who is controlling the plant right now?
So at this stage is the staff of state company Energatom, which is the state company responsible for nuclear.
So the Russian military are outside, but they are not telling your staff what to do. Are they intervening in any way in the running of the plant? No,
they are now trying to press the staff and to also to get some orders. But I mean, the people, of course, in tension and big tension, but they are really doing their work. They are doing what they supposed to do, not to happen some accidents there.
But Minister, I guess people right around the world want to know what is going to happen next. What is the strategy here? I mean, is the Ukrainian military going to fight right around the perimeter of the plant? Because if there is more shell fire, if there is more violence, all of the dangers you just referred to with the storage of nuclear waste and everything else, it could still turn that plant into something we don't want to think about.
That's what could happen this night. I mean, and of course, all this shelling could do this. And of course, you understand that one of the missiles which was hit to the fast reactor could go inside this fast reactor and just go to the storage. And that is really the issue of nuclear safety. That's why we appeal to international atomic energy, nuclear energy, and ask for some actions to stop this, because we have also 3 more stations in Ukraine. We have 15 nuclear units in Ukraine.
You seem to be saying, Minister, that the danger in Zaporizhzhia and indeed potential danger in the other nuclear plants in your country is very far from over.
And that is true. That is true. That is true, because we cannot imagine that this situation could happen, even during wartime. That could happen the situation when the militaries shell directly to the nuclear units. And that is, that's once again, that's my point, that this is not just a question of Ukraine. That is a question of global security, I mean, and of the world. And that's why we ask for why we're asking of closing the sky, because if you see the map of Ukraine, you could see that this station in different regions of Ukraine. So we need to close the sky to be safe. I mean, it's not just for Ukraine; it's for the whole world, really.
Yeah, Minister German Galashenko, we thank you very much indeed for joining us on BBC News. Now, we've been telling you about the NATO foreign ministers who are meeting in Brussels today, and we can bring you now the words of British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who was speaking just before she went into the foreign ministers' meeting.
Foreign Secretary, first of all, can you just tell us about the situation with this nuclear power plant at the moment? How concerned are you, and what more can the West do to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again?
Well, this was a completely reckless act. We've heard now that the fire has been extinguished, but it is extremely concerning that forces are prepared to do this. We've called for an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council. This is a threat to European security and stability, and we need those responsible to be held to account.
You're here in Brussels for meetings with NATO foreign ministers, G7, EU foreign ministers. What do you hope to achieve today?
What today is about is showing the strength of our unity in challenging Vladimir Putin, in stopping Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. We're doing all we can to support the Ukrainians through defensive weapons, where the UK led. We were the first European country to donate defensive weapons. And we're also going to be talking about sanctions. We've been very coordinated in sanctions. We've shown huge unity. It's having a big effect in Russia, but we now need to do more. We particularly need to look at the oil and gas sector. How do we reduce our dependence across Europe on Russian gas? How do we cut off the funding to Vladimir Putin's war machine? That's what I'm going to be advocating at both the G7 and the discussions with the EU.
You raise sanctions. Why is the UK slower in sanctioning Russian oligarchs than the US and the EU?
Well, we've led the way in sanctions, first of all in bank freezes, where we're doing more than our counterparts, also in closing our airspace and our ports to Russian vessels and Russian aircraft, and we are advocating more on oil and gas. And in fact, we've sanctioned more companies than our counterparts across the world. We've just sanctioned 2 more major oligarchs last night. But what I'm doing is looking at how we can speed up that process to make even more progress on that front. The number one thing's important, though, is that we are unified with our partners across the world in putting the toughest ever sanctions we've had on Russia.
Britain's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss there, who has now joined that meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels. Russian and Ukrainian negotiators said they had made limited progress at ceasefire talks, agreeing on the need for humanitarian corridors for civilians. Well, Jens Lierke is spokesperson for the UN Office for Humanitarian Coordination. He joins me now on the line from Geneva. Mr. Lierke, thanks for joining us. We heard about that agreement on humanitarian corridors. What more can you tell me about whether it's going to be turned into reality?
Well, first of all, we welcome these reports that there is an agreement between the parties for a safe passage of civilians out of these areas that are under relentless bombardment, but also we certainly hope that agreement of safe passage also allows humanitarian aid to get in to those who choose to stay behind. It remains to be seen what the details are of that. Of course, humanitarian organizations and the United Nations stand ready to work with the parties so that we ensure that such an operation is done in a way that's both dignified, that protect the civilians, and that it is safe.
Yes, I mean, you say the details have yet to be worked out. It's the details that really matter, isn't it? Is there going to be any sort of military involvement in the creation of this corridor? How on earth would the people be protected if they did try to flee?
Well, that is exactly what we need to sort out now. We have just, as the rest of the world, heard these announcements. We are trying to clarify what exactly they have in mind. We stand ready. We have the capacity, and we have people who are happy to work with the parties so that we ensure that this is done first and foremost in a way that protects those civilians who desperately need to get out, but also, as I say, get the aid in. It is still early days.
Well, you say it's early days, but the need is very urgent, Mr. Lierke, isn't it? I mean, we understand there are perhaps 290,000 people in Mariupol, just to take one instance. They have been shelled for more than 40 hours now. Much of the city is in ruins. They need to get out. They have no access to electricity, to water, really to food as well. So this isn't about waiting days to get an agreement. It has to happen very quickly. Do you believe it can?
Well, we believe that the parties have now shown an interest in doing this. Of course, the best humanitarian aid right now is a cessation of those hostilities. Stop this from happening right now. That we are not seeing. We still call for that, obviously, as the United Nations. But in the meantime, this is the best thing, perhaps, that we can do. And you're absolutely right. We need this to have happened days ago. The Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, who's with us here in Geneva, as a matter of fact, has been working relentlessly on the phones with all the parties, a very senior level, to try to make a thing like this happen. He's willing to set the whole organization behind it to work out the details so this is done, so that those millions of people who are trapped in these areas get some relief.
What are your channels of communication to the Russian side like? Because ultimately this can only happen if the Russians do agree to stop their bombardment.
There are communications at all levels, very senior level with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, with the Ministry of Defense, through the ambassadors and other representatives of the Russian Federation.
Jens Lierke, we thank you very much indeed for joining us on BBC News from Geneva. Now, as we've been reporting, hundreds of thousands of people have left Ukraine already for the safety of neighbouring EU countries. But there are also some people heading the other way. Ukrainians returning to their country to join relatives or to take up arms against the Russian forces. Our Europe correspondent Mark Lowen has this report.
The farewell of fear. Ukrainian hearts split between safety in Poland and a desire, a need to return. Driven by patriotism, bravery and knowledge they're outgunned by the enemy. They left from Krakow, packing to survive a siege. A 3-hour trip to the border towards the darkness of war, praying for protection. En route, there's no respite from the news back home.
My parents want that I stay to Poland, but...
Lila hasn't even told her mum and dad she's returning.
Would they be worried about you going back to Ukraine?
My parents worried about it, but I think everything will be okay.
Many going back to fight, like husband and wife Alexander and Maria, have no military experience, just the love for their country.
Everyone says we shouldn't return, but we have to. We can't live like it's all normal here, while there's war there. People tell us they'd like to be in our place. I would even swap with them. But of course we are afraid about going back.
When the war started, I couldn't sleep or eat. Then we decided to go home, and that made us feel better. I will cry when I see my family. Because when the fighting began, I was scared I would never see them alive again.
At the border, we left them, their journey continuing into the fog of war.
It is so strange to think that just over a week ago, they would have crossed this border freely and without another thought. But now it has become a frontier into danger, cleaving Europe. And once they cross, they don't know if or when they'll see safety again.
It took Alexander and Maria another 24 hours to reach their city, Zhytomyr, which was heavily bombed. We tried to talk several times, but finally her message: "I'm so sorry we can't speak. We're under extreme stress from what is happening to our country." Mark Lowen, BBC News, on the Poland-Ukraine border.
As a result of the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, NATO operations are now intensifying in Europe as the alliance boosts its presence in the east. And part of that mission involves special surveillance flights which can monitor the skies above Ukraine whilst remaining inside NATO airspace. Our Europe correspondent Jessica Parker was invited on board one of those flights.
There's something different about this plane. It's carrying a long-range radar. This is what's known as NATO's Eyes in the Sky. And up there you can see a radar dome because it's a surveillance plane. Now, we're told operations from this base in Western Germany have really intensified since the Russian invasion. This flight's about to take off, and we're going to be on it. It's rare to get access to one of these missions. We're heading to southeast Poland. So we're on board a Boeing 707, and it's not exactly a passenger plane. For one thing, there are hardly any windows. It is, in fact, a flying office, and as you can see, a pretty extraordinary one.
Yeah, they haven't set up a sensor area yet, so...
A military alliance of 30 countries. Up here, they police NATO's skies.
We are in Polish airspace, and we are located roundabout at the Belarusian and Ukrainian border.
If there's unknown aircraft entering NATO airspace, they can help scrambled jets to investigate. There's a lot going on.
I'm in charge of the radar. We use it to scan the air.
Right here we've got the surveillance team who is responsible for producing recognized air picture.
With our radar, we're able to see pretty far out, and then whatever we do see, we report that.
They won't go into Ukraine. It isn't in NATO, but the conflict unfolding right on its borders.
Well, the challenge of this mission is that suddenly it is in your own backyard. If it is somewhere else, you don't feel as anxious as we are doing now, but knowing this is Europe in your own backyard, it gives you a little bit of an extra tension in there.
We've been in the air about 5 hours now, and we're in Polish airspace, sort of doing a figure of 8. But we've been told we're going to be in the air an extra 2 hours. Seems they want to keep going, keep collecting information.
One sombre reason for why we stayed longer is explained as the mission wraps up.
We definitely detected a large number of Russian or Belarusian aircraft that marshaled in Belarus and then ingressed into Ukraine for probably about 20 minutes and then egress back to the north. So we were able to see that occurring in real time and report it up.
NATO is sometimes accused in this situation of just watching on. Does it feel like that's what you're doing?
I don't think so. Again, our role is to protect NATO territory and ensure the sovereignty of NATO airspace.
Up here, you really do feel you're on the edge of NATO's borders, staying within its limits while looking beyond them. Jessica Parker, BBC News.
Now, before we leave you for a short break, a reminder of our top story this hour. Russian forces have seized the largest nuclear plant in Europe after shelling it overnight and causing a fire. The Ukrainian authorities say the plant is secure and radiation levels are normal. It is the latest indication of an intensified Russian assault across several fronts. President Zelensky has accused Moscow of resorting to nuclear terror. He urged Russians to protest. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said it shows the recklessness of war. In the past few minutes, the UK has asked the UN Security Council for a meeting over the attack.
Hello. For some of you, it's been a sunny Friday so far. For others, a soggy one. And that balance isn't going to switch much as we go through the rest of today. This satellite imagery shows a strip of cloud, which is actually just thinning in situ rather than moving one way or another. It may thin a little bit this afternoon across some parts of eastern Scotland into the Pennines, parts of the Midlands. So chances of turning a bit brighter here, but still outbreaks of rain across many eastern areas from it. East Anglia, well, many here stay dry. Winds coming in from the southeast. It's further west, though. Sunny spells, one or two isolated showers, bit of a northwesterly breeze, but temperatures of around 9 or 10 Celsius. Coolest of all down some of those North Sea coasts. Into this evening and overnight, area cloud and patchy rain. Well, it comes confined mainly to eastern counties of England. Away from that, with some clear skies and only one or two showers around, it is going to be a colder night tonight more widely. Widespread frost, the blue colours here in Scotland, Northern Ireland, down to -4, -5 for a few, but a chance of frost still possible. Wales and western parts of England. And that frost risk will be there throughout this weekend. Increasing chance of some lingering fog too. But the general story this weekend, especially for those of you who've got the wet weather at the moment, it will turn drier and brighter. Now for Saturday, first of all, that cloud, outbreaks of rain and a bit of a cold breeze continues across some eastern parts of England. And through the day, after some early morning sunshine, we'll push towards the southwest and southeastern parts of Wales. Away from it, though, you start the day sunny and you should end it sunny. A very pleasant day in store. Showers few and far between. Most will stay dry. Then as we go through into Sunday, high pressure builds around our weather front. That will start to squeeze the last dregs of rain or drizzle out of it. There could still be the remnants of it to the south where there'll be a bit of a breeze, but with high pressure becoming more established, Sunday, a widely dry day across the country. There could be some lingering mist and fog patches around and a bit of low cloud maybe drifting in off the North Sea as well. Windiest down towards the south and across the parts of the Hebrides, but for most, once you get the sunshine out, that March sunshine is gaining a little bit of warmth. It will feel quite pleasant. Our area of high pressure then nudges eastwards as we go through into the early part of next week. Low pressure systems trying to work in its way from the west, and it's going to be those two there or thereabouts this coming week. So keep an eye on the forecast. There could be some subtle changes, but as for early part of next week, many will be dry and bright, but turning windier and a bit colder too. Bye for now.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines, Europe, the Taliban, China. There is an awful lot to consider. Let's take this stage by stage. Here's the BBC's Stephen McDonald in Beijing. So help me understand the politics of this. Let's look at some of the international reactions. Tell us what you've been hearing. In practical terms, what does that mean? Next, we have to step back and let's just remind ourselves this is all part of the same story.
Piece the story together with Ross Atkins. Outside Source. Weekdays at 7 on the BBC News Channel.
This is actually the main road out of the capital and a whole line of traffic trying to get out.
Open the door, I could see all the houses roofs were hanging off and grab my daughter and just take her outside.
I mean, I was gone from this world for 5 minutes until they got my heartbeat back.
Creating mini-stars inside reactors like this is one of the greatest technological challenges humanity has ever faced.
The BBC News Channel. More than just the headlines.
And
And one person who's not sitting is Carol.
What is your message to people like that this morning? Is that your position now?
That BBC Breakfast, I take that all day.
BBC Breakfast. Join us on the best seat in the house.
This is BBC News with me, Stephen Sackur. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. Our top stories this hour. World leaders condemn the attack on Europe's largest nuclear power plant. It is now secure. Ukraine's president accuses Moscow of nuclear terror. The International Atomic Energy Energy Agency confirms the site was hit, but not the reactors themselves. No radioactive material has been released.
All the safety systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected at all.
Meanwhile, Mariupol in the south of Ukraine has become a city under siege as power and water supplies are cut off by relentless Russian shelling. Plus, is this the twilight of the oligarchs? More sanctions on Russia's super rich, but Ukrainians tell the West it must stop buying Russian oil and gas too. The United Nations says 1 million refugees have now left Ukraine since the Russian invasion began. More than half of them have gone to Poland. Many will have travelled there from the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, just over 65 kilometres from the border. Lviv isn't occupied by Russian forces for now, but there are people living in the city who understand what it does mean to be invaded. Fergal Keane has this report from Lviv.
It is relentless. In a station where they load aid for the embattled armies in the east, and coming the other way, families propelled into exile by President Putin's war. Today the number who fled exceeded 1 million, with many more on the move. These are Roma gypsies who've escaped the Russian advance on Kharkiv, 1,000 kilometers to the east. What is it like in Kharkiv? The war. It's difficult, said Pavel. Everything is burning, everything is destroyed. No one is listening to us. No one wants to help us. His daughter Sonia says, it's terrible. The Roma have an inherited memory of war's trauma. Tens of thousands were murdered by the Nazis in World War II. And this city of Lviv, a crossroads of east and west, saw one of the worst pogroms directed at Jews by the Germans and Ukrainian collaborators. This isn't about trying to draw exact historical parallels, and both Russia and Ukraine suffered terribly during the Second World War. But if you're somebody who has a personal lived experience of that terrible time, then this is a period of increased anxiety, history casting a long, deep shadow. I met someone in Lviv bearing the trauma of present and past. Tatiana Zabramnaya is 84 years old, a survivor of the Holocaust.
Я ее спрашивала все время про войну, что, как и почему. Она мне никогда ничего не рассказывала, начинала дрожать, плакать и просила не напоминать ей про войну. Видно, муж сестры моей мамы, сестра пострадала, да. Они были в Киеве. Мне мама говорила, что их расстреляли или как, не знаю, в общем.
Now Tatiana has family who are trapped in Kyiv.
У меня есть дочка и приемный сын. У меня есть внучка, которая сейчас, к сожалению, находится там, где идут бои, в Киеве. Кто бы мог подумать, что повторится 22 июня 1941 года со стороны России. Это ужасно.
This great city is now a temporary haven. It's also where lawyers first discussed the very concept of genocide and crimes against humanity. Like historian Sofia Diak, who now helps refugees and worries for Ukraine and the world.
You cannot rebuild life which was killed, and there are so many of that happening right now. And the question for us is what kind of world we want to live in the future. The world where, because of, geopolitical situation and world order, we can pay the price for human lives. I mean, this is about here, this is about Syria, this is about so many places in the world.
At the station, a volunteer plays Ukraine's national anthem. Lviv's history is a story of survival, but also of war's immense continuing cost. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Lviv.
OK, let's now get a check on how financial markets across the world have been absorbing the latest developments in the war in Ukraine. Taig Enright joins me now. And Taig, I think extreme volatility still.
A big sell-off, Stephen. Thank you very much. As we've been saying, there has been that big sell-off after news of the fire at Ukraine's biggest nuclear power station. President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of nuclear terror after it bombarded the Zaporizhzhia plant, which is the biggest of its kind in Europe. Authorities do say that the plant is secure and radiation levels are normal, but investors certainly took fright. These are the latest prices from the main European indices. You can see there big sell-offs in the region of 3.1% in the case of the FTSE 100 here in London, 3.6% in the case of the CAC 40 there in Paris. And the price of oil ticking upwards again, $112, not as high as some of the recent peaks we've seen in the past few days of $120 a barrel. Here in London, it's worth pointing out as well, the stock exchange has also suspended the trading of shares in a further 8 companies with links to Russia after doing the same to 27 other companies yesterday. And as we've been saying, that's where the price of oil is now, $112 per barrel. Let's bring in Danny Hewson, who's a financial analyst from AJ Bell. She joins us now from Huddersfield in England. Thanks very much for being with us, Danny. Give us some insight into what was going through the minds of investors whenever they heard the news about what happened at the nuclear plant.
Well, you could see just when panic set in, when Asian investors, they started their sell-off very early as soon as that fire broke out. We saw Asian stocks falling to 16-month lows. Now, they did recover slightly upon the news that the fire had been brought under control, but clearly the prospect that this fighting could lead to some kind of nuclear disaster has very much set investors on edge. And as you say, there's been a huge sell-off across Europe today. In fact, the stock 600 is on course for its worst weekly decline since the pandemic-fueled sell-off in March 2020. Investors really nervous about what this fighting means. Of course, the close proximity of the Ukraine to Europe, and whatever might happen, what kind of nuclear disaster, it wouldn't just impact Ukraine, of course, it would also impact much of Europe as well. And we're also seeing, of course, that huge increase in commodities. So today we're seeing a lot of sell-off of car manufacturers, of course, worried that as prices rise, consumers, they just won't have the money to pay for those cars.
And it sets a bar, doesn't it, Danny, for the unpredictability of this conflict, keeping in mind that there are 15 other nuclear reactors in Ukraine, and this attack and perhaps incidental impact on the nuclear station, depending on what side of events you're following, kind of sets a bar though for recklessness and perhaps unpredictability.
Yeah, markets very much watching every single news bit of footage that comes out to try and figure out exactly what is going on in the minds of those Russian soldiers and, of course, in the mind of Vladimir Putin as well. They're incredibly nervous about what might happen. Is it that Vladimir Putin is trying to use this scare tactics as a negotiating tool to try and bring about some kind of resolution that it wants to happen? Markets are just incredibly nervous. They're going to be volatile for a long time to come as they watch and wait to see what happens.
Danny Hewson, I should say, from AJ Bell. Thank you very much for being with us today. There have, of course, been calls for Western countries to sanction the supply of Russian gas and oil. But let's talk more about what have been the latest wave of sanctions coming out of the United States. The Biden administration has decided to sanction 8 Russian oligarchs and officials, but it is so far resisting calls to put a limit on Russian oil and gas exports because of the impact that it could have on fuel prices and on inflation. Samira Hussein reports from New York.
The Biden administration has imposed yet another round of economic sanctions against Russia. Now, previous sanctions have included Russia's central bank and Russian President Vladimir Putin himself. Now, this latest round is targeting more Russian elites and their family members who enabled Mr. Putin's invasion. Now, the White House has imposed visa restrictions on more than a dozen Russian oligarchs and their families, and it will also punish Russian entities and individuals who enabled the spread of disinformation. Now, these latest moves are not a surprise. U.S. President Joe Biden has repeatedly said he was prepared to continue to impose sanctions as a way to further squeeze Mr. Putin and those that are closest to him. But Russian oil and gas exports remain exempt from American sanctions. Although the White House has said it is open to the idea, but it has been reluctant to take that step as it considers the kind of impact it would have on global oil markets and already soaring U.S. energy prices. And despite that, traders and banks have been reluctant to engage with Russian oil so as not to be seen as funding the invasion in any way.
Hussein there in New York. Let's talk about the economic impact of the war in Ukraine. The head of the World Bank has told the BBC that it will further stoke inflation all around the world. David Malpass has been speaking to my colleague Aaron Heselhurst, and he told him that surging energy and food prices will hit poorer people the hardest. And despite Russia's vast oil and gas reserves, he said its economy has long been mismanaged.
I've emphasized, Russia has weaknesses. Their per capita income has fallen below China's in part because of economic mismanagement and because they really have maintained such a centralized system of decision making under Putin for now, ever since 2000. The risk is that Ukraine is controlled by that. Of course, the immediate risk, and I should say, is the horrifying attack.
David, at the time of this recording, there's a discussion going on at the World Bank for a $350 million aid package for Ukraine. We know this is a fast-moving event, but if that goes through, what will it fund?
It will help fund the budget of Ukraine. So in this particular instance, this type of package is to add on to a previous operation that was done by the World Bank. So it goes to support the land reform that Ukraine has been undertaking, which is critical for its long-term success, and other reforms that were nearing completion before the war broke out.
But on that point, David, are you effectively then underwriting the cost of war for Ukraine, and therefore the World Bank and your near 190 members are effectively taking on Russia?
I don't see it that way at all. What we're doing is looking for ways to support Ukraine as it faces economic catastrophe. And that can be measured in terms of the loss of international reserves that Ukraine is suffering, the loss of tax revenues that they suffer because of the shutdown of the economy.
David, before this war, the rising cost of living was already a huge problem for millions of us around the world. What impact will this war in Ukraine have on that rising cost of everything picture?
The war in Ukraine comes at a bad time for the world because inflation was already rising. And in developing countries, a third of them have already had to raise interest rates. So that puts a real burden on their financial systems and on the poor. The energy cost rises hit everyone, and especially they're a regressive tax. They hit the poor the most, as does inflation. So these are major concerns. Food prices are a very real consideration and problem for people in poor countries and for everyone, really. And they've gone up a lot. Russia and Ukraine are both big food producers.
Could this lead possibly to a global recession?
My view is that that there were plenty of opportunities for growth in the world, and while the inflation rate was a giant concern, it could be addressed with higher output. The world has this amazing ability to create things, and so I think it's too early to say that this will be a recession. What it is a catastrophe for Russia, for Ukraine, and for their neighbors. And the rest of the world will need to adjust very rapidly in order to go forward.
And you can see more of that interview with David Malpass from the World Bank on BBC World News with Talking Business with Aaron Hazelhurst throughout the weekend here. Now, as we've been talking about, all of this disruption of supply chains coming out of Ukraine and Russia is putting further pressure on inflation, with prices rising across the board, in particular for wheat. Its prices have surged towards record highs because of fears that some of the supplies from the Black Sea region could be severely disrupted. Wheat futures are up by some 47% so far this year. Colin Hamilton is a commodities analyst at BMO Capital Markets, and he explained how long this could continue.
We're in one of those environments where supply chains were already stretched to the limit, and we've taken away other options. Now, in that wheat market in particular, you have to think about who is the marginal purchasing manager? How are they thinking? It is probably now an emerging market government, and we do expect them to jump into this market because feeding a population in an inflationary environment is very important for stability. So we would expect to see large government-led purchases over the coming months. And it just adds to that inflationary pressure. Now, the world will adjust, the world will react, we will get a supply response, but in the near term, prices are certainly heading higher still. It's an interesting one for central banks here because we do have pressures coming right, left and centre. Now, typically commodity prices spike. We're getting into that question of how much of this is transient. Some of the logistical issues, well, we're pretty good engineers in the world, we'll be able to sort that. But generally, purchasing managers across the world will have been scarred by this. They've spent much of the past 18 months desperate to get material in, and they'll still be paying higher prices than perhaps you would think in normal market environments. Now, in terms of central banks, I would say developed world central banks have a little bit of wiggle room. Some of these emerging markets, though, where we have seen 5-6 rate hikes already, they're the ones that will feel a bit more pressure. That's the ones you'll be watching for any signs that the global economy has started to stall.
Commodities analyst Colin Hamilton there. That's it from me. Back to you now, Stephen.
Tig, thanks very much indeed. Now, events in Ukraine have put China in a difficult position. It has forged a strategic relationship with Russia, and the two countries have a common interest in acting as a counterweight to Nato. However, Beijing is also on friendly terms with Ukraine and has expressed anxiety about the conflict. David Grossman has more.
The map is being remade. In Western Europe, nations are rediscovering the importance of NATO and of defence spending. And for China, an increasingly significant strategic partner to Russia and geopolitical rival to the United States, there are many dangers in this conflict, as well as a few opportunities.
Well, I think from the beginning of the crisis, China has been trying to balance three conflicting interests. One is to preserve its relationship with Russia, which Xi Jinping is deeply invested in. A second is to not inflict irreparable damage on China's relationship with the West, particularly, of course, the United States, the countries in Europe, and its continued access to advanced technology. And then thirdly, upholding China's long-standing interests in state sovereignty and the territorial integrity.
China and Russia started the year closer than ever. A meeting between President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin produced a 5,000-word joint statement, including the phrase, "Friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation."
The General Assembly is now voting on a draft resolution.
But this week we saw there were limits. At the UN, China abstained on a resolution critical of Russia. And today, the Chinese Foreign Ministry was not mentioning its unlimited friendship with Vladimir Putin, but instead the importance of respecting borders and sovereignty.
China's basic position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and unequivocal. China always believes that all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected, and that international disputes should be resolved peacefully in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter.
I think that China is very worried that this has developed in a way that it did not anticipate, and China is not prepared for. China is being criticized as an enabler of the conflict and is really seen as having gotten very, very close to Russia. And I think that China will pay costs if it continues to lean so heavily toward Moscow.
But could China benefit? It already buys Russian gas and has agreement to buy much more. But if Europe were to stop the pipelines west, well, these are not connected to the pipeline that supplies China. So it's not clear that China could capitalize on Russian separation from Western markets.
If I were the Chinese leadership, I would have preferred to see this at a later point in time, when I would have had the ability to import all of the gas needed from Russia, and also, and this is very important, to have already built a strong enough payment systems, CIPS, China International Payment System, independent from the West, independent from SWIFT, and with a much bigger volume that it does have today, because that would give me an alternative.
With rapidly moving sanctions imposed by the West, China will now be concerned that it could inadvertently fall foul of them if it continues to support Russia economically. Once this invasion had started, China's best solution would have been a rapid Russian victory with minimal damage to Ukraine and minimal disruption to international trade. With every day that passes, the options for China seem less and less attractive.
Ukrainian children with cancer are being treated in a hospital basement while the fighting continues above ground. At Kiev's Children's Hospital, they're using makeshift beds, and Graham Sackur has this report.
A teenage boy injured in a Russian attack. He's been brought to the Children's Hospital in Kiev. The boy is operated on and stabilised. Just a week ago, none of the staff here could have imagined the situation they're now in.
This moment we are actually exhausted. We are tired because we live at the work 24/7, and it's very hard to take yourself in your hand and move on.
There are normally 600 babies and children at this hospital. Most have now been evacuated to safer parts of the country. But still, there are more than 200 children here. They've been moved out of the wards, away from windows for their own safety. Some are in beds, others on chairs. In the basement, a makeshift cancer ward. It is the safest part of the hospital, but an awful environment for the youngest of patients, toddlers and babies.
It's really terrible because, treat patient with the cancer, it's like everyday fight. And now it's like everyday fight in unpredictable situation.
Parents have moved in full time to be with their children. Everyone doing their best to make life feel as normal as possible.
We make a lot of activities for them. I don't remember how it's called. It's, person who has always smiled with this big red nose.
Clown.
Clown. And she has came before the war to our hospital. They have a big group of volunteers. We call them hospital clones. They still come to the shelters. We have a lot of candies, a lot of good goods, which usually we don't give the children, but at this moment, do what you want and wherever you want. I don't know how it's happened, but even one day we have McDonald's in our hospital. Yeah, it's not very healthy food, but in such condition, it's small good emotion to children. So I think it's good for them.
Cities across Ukraine, like Kharkiv in the north, have been bombarded now for days. Staff at the hospital know Kyiv could be next. Are you worried about what will happen, Lesia?
I am a normal person. I really worried. I worried what will be in future. Will be Ukraine exist? The first reason is change mind of Russian people, of Russian soldiers. I don't want you to feel the same I feel. I just want you to stay in your country and don't touch me. That's all what I ask. Nothing, no feeling, no war, just stay in your country and that's all.
Lesia has posted these pictures on her social media page. She embodies the determination of the Ukrainian people to keep on fighting. If the Russians start to bomb the centre of Kyiv, will you stay?
Yes. Until the patients will be in the hospital, I with my husband will stay with the patients.
In one of the rest areas in the hospital, a young girl sings a traditional folk song. It glorifies Ukraine as a beautiful country and its people as proud and brave.
Our coverage of the Ukraine war continues at the top of the hour, so do stay with us.